Ceann Comhairle dús bualam mo cogordius a gháil le machara an tara Jack Chambers agus ní léon doubt a go amach beg an tara Chambers ag obair go crua agus go dtíotalach in ific nua son pobl im líonta se thugann. I just want to start, Ceann Comhairle, by congratulating my colleague, Minister Chambers, on his appointment, and I have no doubt that he'll be a very effective and competent minister in the years ahead, and I wish him well in that regard. Ceann Comhairle, when the history of the 21st century is written in 100 years from now, I think we can safely say that the events of 2020 in general and the particulars of the COVID-19 pandemic specifically will play a very large part in that history of the 21st century. I think the reason for that is twofold. First of all, the impact that the pandemic has had on the lives, the health and the lifestyles of individuals has been enormous. We've seen it not only in this country, but we see it throughout the world as well. Secondly, however, and I think this is something that we're not fully aware of yet, we're not fully aware of what will be the long-term consequences of our response to the pandemic. However, I'm fairly sure, and I regret to say it, that there are going to be very serious repercussions as a result of the response of not just Ireland but other countries to the pandemic, and those were responses that we had to take. I think I've spoken previously, Ceann Comhairle, about the impact that our response to the pandemic has had on certain vulnerable groups in our society. I spoke previously about the impact it is having upon children and young people and victims of domestic violence, and indeed individuals who have mental health issues or people who have special needs. It is apparent that our response has had a very significant impact upon those vulnerable groups. I think it is very important in terms of designing our response to the pandemic that we ensure that we don't subordinate all other societal needs beneath the very legitimate need of seeking to ensure that people don't get sick from the COVID-19 pandemic. The purpose of the legislation we're discussing this morning, Ceann Comhairle, is to try to deal with one of those consequences of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is the severe and significant economic consequences that have arisen as a result of our response to try to curtail the pandemic. In particular, the legislation we're discussing is trying to resolve and target and solve one of the most dangerous consequences of our response to the pandemic, which is unemployment in general, and in particular youth unemployment. Anyone who has looked at recessions in the past will know that one of the most dangerous consequences of a recession is the generation of large youth unemployment. And if you look at the statistics in Ireland at present, I regret to say that when you look at the age group of 15 to 24 years of age, that the unemployment rate in that youth cohort is at present at 45%. Now, that is a highly unusual and hopefully a very temporary high statistic, and it's because of the immediate response to the pandemic caused through the lockdown. I know it will reduce in the months ahead. It is extremely important, however, that we try to ensure that we put in place effective measures so that we don't allow long-term youth unemployment to operate in this country. When you see the impact that long-term unemployment has on a country, you can see the necessity of trying to ensure that that doesn't happen. One of the consequences of people being unemployed for lengthy periods of time is that they lose their connection with the labour force. Employers, I regret to say, become dismissive of somebody who hasn't had employment for a period of time over 1 year or so. So we must do our best to ensure that we try to protect young people in particular from the consequences of long-term youth unemployment. I think when you look at what other countries have done, we can learn a lot from them. We know that in Germany and indeed in Britain and earlier this week in France, they've announced measures to really target unemployment, particularly amongst young people. I welcome the legislation that the government is introducing, and it builds upon decisions that were made by the European Union arising from the powers that are vested in the European Union under Article 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning of that Union. That's an article that isn't used frequently, but it provides power for the Union to provide financial assistance to Member States when there have been exceptional occurrences. Clearly, it is the case that the pandemic is an exceptional occurrence, and because it's an exceptional occurrence, we need exceptional action by the European Union. As a result of that, I think it was on the 19th of May of this year that Regulation 672 was passed by the Council. It established the European instrument known as SURE, and it provided up to €100 billion that is available by the European Union to give to Member States in order to deal with their response to the economic consequences of COVID-19. Obviously, under the provisions, and this is set out in the schedule to the bill, Ireland has to guarantee a certain amount of the contribution, but in turn we can get the benefit of those monies, which we will badly need to ensure that we can protect young people in particular from the devastation of long-term unemployment. I think we also need to recognise that this recession is unusual. Never before have we had a recession that was deliberately caused by governments. We were right to cause the recession when you look back at what was happening in March 2020, when we saw what was happening in the intensive care units and emergency departments in Spain and Italy. We had no alternative but to ensure that we tried to protect our own intensive care units and emergency departments by bringing in the lockdown. But that was a very deliberate act by us. We knew the consequences. Perhaps we didn't understand fully the long-term consequences of it, but we did know that there would be consequences to that lockdown. And just as we were very deliberate in closing down the economy, now we have to be very deliberate in opening it up again. That requires state intervention. And I think we need to recognise that in order to prevent long-term unemployment, we need to take extraordinary measures. And I would say to Minister Chambers that maybe we need to take measures even beyond what is being discussed here today. This is a very beneficial proposal which is available under the European Union's Article 122 provision. But it could be the case that we have to take further steps, as has been taken in the United Kingdom and as has been taken in France, as I say, announced earlier this week. And we need to be radical about it, because if we allow a whole cohort of young people to become long-term unemployed, it's going to have a very significant detrimental impact, not just on them, but on our whole society. And our society will not recover from having a young cohort of people who do not have any secure employment. I also think we need to recognise that people have been affected by the lockdown in very many different ways. But a group that probably haven't been given sufficient attention to date and who have very significantly been damaged are people under the age of 40. In fairness to them, their economic security, their work lives have to a certain extent been put on hold for the purpose of trying to ensure that we protect the health of people who are predominantly more elderly than them. They did that selflessly. They were prepared to do it. But I think we must recognise that we have a responsibility to them as well, to ensure that society protects them. Young people have very insecure economic positions, not just in Ireland, but around the Western world at present. If you look at the, I suppose, the terms of their employment, whether or not they have any pension provision in the future, their ability to access accommodation which is secure and affordable. All of those factors are uncertainties in the lives of most people under 40 years of age. And it's unusual that they find themselves in a position where their own economic security is less than that was the case of their parents. That is unusual for this country. It is unusual for the world. So the state must recognise that we have a responsibility to repay to those young people the selfless acts they've engaged in. They are the people whose careers have been to a large extent damaged as a result of the lockdown. We must ensure that we do not allow a large cohort of them to drift into long-term unemployment. So obviously this is a very worthwhile piece of legislation, Ceann Comhairle. I commend Minister Chambers for steering it through the Houses of the Oireachtas. I think it will be of benefit to the country in trying to protect our society from the impact of long-term unemployment. However, I will just conclude, as I said before, that we should not close ourselves off from other alternative options that we may need to take on our own bat without having to rely upon the European Union to direct us. I think it's a very strong challenge ahead of us, but we need to ensure for the future of the country, and in particular for the future of young people who are our future, that we protect them from the ravages of long-term unemployment. Thanks very much, Can Corla. I know you probably think I went on longer than I was supposed to, but I know from my colleague Deputy O'Connor that, contrary to what Deputy Flaherty said, he's not speaking in this group. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.